plight of the poor people of the earth. The question is, what do we think about the condition of the so-called native people in Americas and the so-called blacks in America? It's a very important topic, very complex topic, the deplorable condition of our people scattered worldwide. But that requires to go back into the ancient culture, that anyone that has any sense of global events will understand.
When we look into the world today, we will see the total devastation of God's chosen people, the 12 tribes of Israel, which are the so-called blacks or African Americans, the Mexicans, Latinos, the so-called Native American Indians, Puerto Ricans, the Haitians, and so on and so forth. We have been the most diseased and poverty-stricken people scattered amongst the four corners of the earth. You look at places like the slave coast of Africa, the Caribbean, Mexico, as well as Latin America, and see the total devastation of our people, the horrendous condition
of certain places in the world where the conditions are still deplorable and very bad. Poverty to the highest level, organized crime, sickness, poor educational systems, no government at all to rule them righteously. Now the questions we must ask ourselves is, why are these people suffering so much? And who is going to help them?
Take, for instance, the slave coast of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, if you will. When you see the condition, starting from, you first of all have to ask the question, how did they get there? Who were there? What was the indigenous culture and language that they spoke before their first European encounter? They were decentralized into full function, had great civilization, were full-fledged society that was sustainable by itself, with language and culture and history. But that even goes deeper, if you will. But starting from the first encounter with the European, when you look at that today, you have the Francophone, the Anglophone, and then you have countries like, you have the Belgian. Let's take, for instance, the Nigeria battle against the British. The country was created, between, you have the Igbos, who we know are the Jews, the Yoruba, also the ancient, you have to study their ancient history that links with the Igbos, and then you look at also the people that comprise these people. The boundaries were drawn arbitrarily. Civil wars, intrigues was conducted. Now you have people that are actually suffering and they cannot deal. We have to deal deeper to understand what's going on. And then you go down to Angola, colonized by the Portuguese. I've lived in Angola, I've lived in, as a war traveler, I've lived in Portugal, studied their language as well. And you see the deplorable poverty and condition of our people in Angola.
Guerras civis em Angola que pararam aqui no ano 2002. Como é que esses dois países, um na África e o outro na América do Sul, grandes países cheios de riqueza, sofrendo assim? Quando a gente olha para Portugal e Lisboa, a gente não pode comparar a sofrência, a pobreza. Há uma grande diferença. O Portugal tem bons sistemas políticos, sistemas de escola, as ruas, os carros, as casas bonitas, eletricidade. Por que o Portugal está em melhor condições que Angola e o Brasil? E falamos todo português.
I couldn't believe it. Lack of infrastructure. The deplorable condition. Economic woes, poor leadership, if you will, that so pervades those areas. I was was shocked what I saw. And then when I went to Portugal, in Lisbon, then you saw the massive development. What are the differences in terms of existence of a certain people and in the so-called developed world and the developing world? This is the issue at the crux of the matter. Those two create an exploitation and the exploited. One takes advantage economically, socially, otherwise, politically. One is taken advantage of. And we see the same thing pervades across where the so-called poor people are, the so-called dark, black, Negroes, and you have the exploiters on one hand that have set up the existing systems. Then you go to places like in Congo, for instance. Congo was controlled by same thing. You have what's his name? King Leopold. Leopold II, gave a mandate, actually requested a mandate from then global leaders, and actually went into the Congo and destroyed so much people, in the quest for, rubber as a resource, which was part of some of the resources. They're looking for tin, rubber, minerals, all kinds of natural resources that was used to engineer industrial revolution. And afterwards, many people were massacred. You're talking about massive amounts of hands that were chopped off, like mountain tops, because they did not meet their quota of rubber. Exploited, took everything, and left the people, and left the government ultimately in the hand of Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu, as we know, was supported by the French and American government. So while he was actually promoting Pan-Africanism, he was being supported from the outsiders and moved all his money overseas as well, where he had extravagant shopping. So why they support Mobutu to uphold the liberalization of the market, even though he was a totalitarian, if you will, a dictator, they did not care about the people. So you're looking at an issue of leadership, and from selfish leaders come from home, and then the issue of foreign influence after freedom fighters and liberation movement from 1800s to the 1900s. It's significant to understand these dynamics, to be able to speak deeply on the issue of the plight of our people that are suffering, if you will. So then you look at Zambia, for example. Zambia is a nation rich in mineral resources. Zambia is a nation that exported copper. Again, tremendous poverty, and then you see the contrast between them and Switzerland. I lived in Switzerland as well. As you know, Switzerland is the financial district of the world. That's where all the deals are made, if you will. All their resources are being controlled by corporations that use tax advantages. They used, political gain by setting up subsidiary companies to take advantage of the local people. So again, you see another form of exploitation. The result of all these things is high level of unemployment, a government that is so irresponsible and disconnected from the people. You're looking at the fingerprint of the globalist that has hijacked the resources of the people and left them with nothing, and they cannot, mobilize themselves. But again, the problem still goes deeper. No, now you're talking about starting from the 1500. You have the Arab slave trade, and then subsequently the transatlantic slave trade. All this continued with a massive migration of people outside. You're talking about massive exploitation and exporting of resources to build Western world. And hence, the condition has been already established from behind. So you have to go back again to look at what happened and why it had to happen. And who did that? And what are they doing to help the situation? And what are people doing to understanding what exactly happened to them? That what needs to happen. And now you start coming into the indigenous people of Americas. Same thing continues. Same story continues. You're looking at the destruction of the Indies. if you will. Take, for instance, Haiti. We know the history of Haiti, level of exploitation, the freedom fighters, same thing continued, because we know essentially the slaves were carried off from those areas, just like resources were carried off from the sub-Saharan and indigenous Africa to the New World to engineer industrial revolution. So, and Haiti is a case in point.
Dans le 18e siècle, un dénommé Napoléon est rentré dans les îles d'Haïti pour faire la guerre avec le peuple qu'on nomme haïtien aujourd'hui. Un homme du nom d'Ouverture Toussaint a réussi à les repousser. Mais malheureusement, ça n'a pas été assez. L'Haïti a été affecté par plusieurs coups d'État.
Same issue with corrupt government, also controlled by America. Puerto Rico, the same thing, the port of riches, where Christopher Columbus also came in and actually dealt with the people directly, exploited, and took out lots of resources. Now we see the same people continuing to suffer. But we're still speaking about issue of their condition. But the question still remains, who are these people? Can we go back to the ancient country, the history, to find out who they are and understand why all these things has to happen? Jamaica, as we know, many of the slaves that were carried from Jamaica came from the slave coast of Africa, all the way from the Igbos, the Yoruba. You need to understand the indigenous people on those slave coasts all the way down to Angola. They were brought to obviously to the places in Bahama, Dominican Republic as well. These mosaic cultures that were created as a result of Western European conquest. If we need to speak about poverty and their condition, we need to stay directly and speak truly, and tell those people exactly what's going on and who they are if we're trying to solve the issue that actually faces them. And then you going into Mexico, you know, the indigenous people in North Central South America, as we know, history book confirms that. We have a book called The Origin of American Racism. It's called Lost Tribes on Promised Land. That actually tells you that they're all from the lost tribes of Israelites. And this thing cannot be underemphasized. You need to understand, just like the Negroes in the slave coast, you need to understand them, particularly the Igbos, the Jews, the centralized over there. We need to understand their history. What does that have to do with their plight and their condition? So here you have they have the Mayans, you have the Incas, the Aztecas, the Peruvians. After a great destruction, again having their first encounter with the European, and left them destitute and still controlled. The problem still continues. So all the way into Central America, and as you know, here in North American Indians. The North American Indians has been totally epitomized what you called the imperialistic eradication. But it's not just about the destruction. We need to ask the question, who are these people? And why did all this thing has to happen? You're talking about 150 million people were wiped out in a fully rich and luscious environment, you know, at hemisphere, North Central South America, that created this Spaniard culture, if you will. In Panama, for example, Panama was rich, you know, lots of havens, you know, shipping and distribution of goods, and it was needed by American president actually wanted it at the time. Here, a book called a book called The Confession of Economic Hitmen by John Perkin that speaks grimly about this situation. The reason is because we've talked about the ancient condition, now we're speaking about the current condition, ancient colonization and imperialism, and then you're looking at the modern condition, which is neocolonialism. Here this book presents a case in point for South America and indigenous people in America. A case in point was presented and articulated well in this book, in his expose, John Perkins. highly paid professional who he talks about how he, he cheated on countries. Their tools included fraudulent financial reports, rigged election payoffs, extortion, sex, murder, to play a game as old as empire, but one that has taken on terrifying dimensions during this time of globalism. So you have new form of globalism or new form of imperialism is what we're still dealing with today. Again, the question still remains, why? It continues, an economic hitman for an international consortium firm. Now, when you find out that this international consortium firm was actually set up by the CIA, that's what they don't tell you. There's a hand over the condition of poverty. There's a hand, because you're talking about poverty, unemployment, infrastructural degradation. You're looking at children that can't even have any sense of existence. Same thing from Zambia, we saw that in Zambia, same thing across in North Central South America. Government are being controlled and taken over. And here we see where he mentions an economic hitman of an international consulting firm. He convinced developing countries to accept enormous loans to funnel that money to U.S. corporations. American government and international aid agencies then requested that their pound of flesh include access to natural resources, mineral corporations, military corporations, and political support. Confession of an Economic Hitman is a story of one man's experience inside the intrigue, the greed, the corruption, the little-known government and corporate activities that the American has been involved in since World War II, and which have dire consequences for the future of democracy and the world. As you can see, this is a powerful book that he came out to confess. It's amazing. But I'm going to read from this page here. It says, on page 66, he says, using Panama in terms of the agenda that keeps our people in their condition worldwide. He says here, the bottom paragraph says, Panama was part of Colombia when the French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps, who directed construction of the Suez Canal, decided to build a canal through the Central Americas Isthmus to connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. Beginning in 1881, the French undertook a mammoth effort that met with one catastrophe after another. Finally, in 1888, the project ended in financial disaster, but it has inspired a dream in Theodore Roosevelt. During the first year of the 20th century, the United States demanded that Colombia sign a treaty, turning the isthmus over to a North American consortium. Colombia refused. In 1903, President Roosevelt sent in the U.S. warship Navy. U.S. soldiers landed, seized and killed a population local military commanded, and declared Panama an independent nation. A puppet government was installed. The final canal treaty was signed. It established an Amazon zone on both sides of the future waterways, legalized U.S. military intervention, and gave Washington virtual control over this newly formed independent nation. Obviously, it's not independent because they still control it. So how independent can that be? Interestingly, the treaty was signed by U.S. Secretary of State Hay and a French engineer, Philippe Bernou Varela, who has been part of the original team, but it was not signed by a single Panamanian. Think about that. In essence, Panama was forced to leave Colombia in order to serve the United States in a deal struck by an American and Frenchman, in retrospect, a prophetic beginning. Think about that. So, again, you see the same culprits going about it everywhere, now using institutions, using a new strategy to continue to keep the poor people across the world down. For more than half a century, Panama was ruled by an oligarchy of wealthy families with strong connections to Washington. They were right-wing dictators who took whatever measures they deemed necessary to ensure that their country promoted U.S. interest. And the same thing is obviously, that's why this the clandestine corporation and institution that are set up by the Westerners is to essentially follow their own interest and their agenda, not the indigenous people agenda. So same story, just a new strategy. In the matter of most of Latin American dictators who allied themselves with Washington, Panama rulers interpreted U.S. interest to mean putting down any popularist movement that smacked down of socialism. They also supported CIA and NSA in an anti-communist activists throughout the hemisphere. Think about that. Again, these are clandestine projects that you and I are not supposed to know about, why there's poverty and oppression in a new way. Amazing. And it continues that they also supported CIA and NSA in an anti-communist activity throughout the hemisphere, and they helped big American businesses like Rockefeller Standard Oil. Think about that. And United Fruits. Rockefeller links to the Rothschilds, who are actually, now this is deep right here. You're talking about Rockefeller, who we know are Jewish, the Standard Oil, their control, as well as that. Now you're speaking about American history now, and that they're controlled by the Rothschilds, if you will. Speaking about European and American history, total domination of the world, the oligarchs, if you will, that are behind the slavery, behind everything, the condition of our people. And they're also behind the Zionist regime in Jerusalem that took over the land of all these poor people scattered worldwide. Now you see how deep this problem is. You gotta research this stuff now. So these governments apparently did not feel that U.S. interests were promoted by improving the lives of people who live in dire poverty or serve as virtual slaves to bring to the plantation and the corporations. And that's what we are. And as we know, plantation and corporations are synonymous. Plantation is the work of globalism. Corporation is the work of globalism. Plantation is a byproduct of imperialism, if you will. They are all the same strategy. That's with John Perkins. Then you have the next book. Panama is an example. The next thing is, as you know, is Colombia. Colombia, again, was a free state, did very well. They lacked infrastructural development. Guys like John Perkins will go over there. He actually, in this book, clearly confessed. You have some freedom fighters that fought against Western interest or Western control institutions, if you will. However, there are assassinations. These are the things that the media that are controlled won't tell you about, because obviously they also control the media. That's a whole different topic. However, John Perkins mentioned that in Colombia, what they did is essentially there's no resistance, if you will, and they went in there. He developed financial project focus that were highly inflated, and he actually used that to essentially make the people dependent, because they're going to give you high interest loan. Now, letting you know that the what you call NGOs, non-governmental organizations like IMF, World Bank, you have the International Banks of Settlement that also in Switzerland, all controlled by the same global entities, Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. These institutions are the ones behind all these things, and they use these new institutions like IMF to enslave the people. You have to devalue your economy. In the case of Zambia, Zambia was told essentially in one form or another, you have to devalue your economy, you have to devalue your currency, and now you become dependent. Now it opens up, your money goes to nothing. It opens up the market for foreign people to come. You're looking for foreign direct investment, but that actually comes foreign direct exploitation, if you will. It opens up your market. Now the people actually cannot find good jobs. They cannot find stable schools, infrastructure. They come with the false pretense, like in Colombia, with the pretenses of coming in to establish and to help you build infrastructure. They actually give you expensive, huge loans that they know they're never going to be able to repay. And hence, through interest now, they enslave a whole people. This is the game. Just like you saw in America. The Negroes here in America suffering. That were brought also here in the ghettos since the 60s movement. The same plight continues with the people. Going through massive, over 110 million people were carried off, only 10% made it. Now we're still dealing with that issue. After civil rights movement, after the emancipations of the 1800s, we're still in the same condition. Why are all these people facing the same plight? Why there's another people that are actually enjoying their expense and their exploitation? This is the issue, how complex it can be, that I don't think that our people are ready to look into.
We are the only people proven historically to fit the cursed people described in Deuteronomy chapter 28. We have endured all types of social and political discord, eugenic agendas, as well as instigated genocide. Our people have lost everything. We have lost our land, we have lost our culture, we've lost our language, our heritage, and more importantly, we have lost our identity. We have lost our identity through global mass deception, through media influence. We have forgotten that we are a holy people, above all nations, to be set apart.
Los indígenas que viven en estos países están viviendo en condiciones deplorables, mucha pobreza y no tienen conocimiento de su historia. Vamos a leer un pasaje en la Biblia y Oseas capítulo 4 versículo 6. Mi pueblo fue destruido porque le faltó conocimiento. Por cuanto desechaste el conocimiento, yo te echaré del sacerdocio. Y porque olvidaste la ley de tu Dios, también yo me olvidaré de tus hijos. Lo que está pasando en estas tierras después de la conquista no cambió. Nosotros tenemos que regresar a todos los mandamientos del Señor, de nuestro Dios, porque necesitamos su poder para cambiar.
Another book, as you see here, is The Conquest of the American Holocaust, the true Holocaust. Powerful, that shows you what the North American Indians went through here. Again, we have history book that shows that they spoke Hebrew. All the towns and cities and states here are all Hebrew. That's a known history that have been suppressed in the Rothschild and Rockefeller controlled education, if you will, education institutions. So here in this book, listen to what it says. By 1492, this is page 74, David Stannard. By 1492, we already had noted that the population of Hispaniola had fallen from 8 million to between 4 million people. By 1508, it was down to less than 100,000. And by 1518, it numbered less than 20,000. And by 1535, says the leading scholars of this grim topic, quote, for all practical purposes, the native population was extinct. This is the encounter, the desolation, just like in the slave coast of Africa, the same plight befell our people. Slavery, plantation, total eradication and depopulation. It says here, in less than normal lifetime of a single human being, an entire culture of millions of people, thousands of years residing in their homes, has been exterminated. The same fate befell the native people of the surrounding islands in the Caribbean also. Of all the horrific genocide that have occurred in the 20th century against the Jews, that's talking about the Negroes are the real Jews as we know. That should be where the limelight should go first and foremost. And all these people that we're mentioning, he talks about here against the Jews. Here he talks about the Igbos. The word Igbo is Hebrew as we know. He talks about the Bengalis, the Capuchins, Ugandans, and more none has come close to destroying this many or this great a portion of wholly innocent people. Speaking about the massacre of the Indies. And then the Spaniards turned their attention to the mainland of Mexico and Central America. The slaughter has barely begun. The exquisite city of Tenochtitlan was next. This is how the system was built. So if we need to speak about the issue of poverty and the plight and the condition that our people are facing, that none want to even go to the root of the matter, we need to understand who these people are. We need to see why these things has to happen. Why did it have to happen?
Now we must ask ourselves this question. How is it possible? And why did God let this happen? We're going to read from Deuteronomy, the 32nd chapter, and we will start from verse 21. And we'll give you an idea of what happened and why it happened. Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 21. They have moved me to jealousy with that which is not God. They have provoked me to anger with their vanities, and I will move them to jealousy with those which are not a people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. For a fire is kindled in mine anger, and shall burn unto the lowest hell, and shall consume the earth with her increase, and set on fire the foundations of the mountains. I will heap mischiefs upon them. I will span mine arrows upon them. They shall be burned with hunger, and devoured with burning heat, and with bitter destruction. I will also send the teeth of beasts upon them, with the poison of serpents of the dust. The sword without, and terror within, shall destroy both the young man and the virgin, the suckling also with the man of gray hairs. I said, I will scatter them into the corners. I will make the remembrance of them to cease from amongst men.
What you see, what you're going to find out is that these people are one nation. That's what Western centric educational system don't tell you. These people are one nation of people. Even all the way in Australia, the indigenous people in Australia. There's a reason why this level of orchestrated effort by the globalists and the oligarchs, the brain trust of the prevalent systems, from education to politics to history. In fact, as we know, democracy and politics are all used. Democracy and communism were all tools of the same intellectuals that set up and engineered the system. These people are the children of Israel. That's the secret that they're not telling us. We need to understand their history from a scriptural standpoint. We need to understand how it was already prophesied that all these things will happen to them. And there is a need. This conquest, their history is full of conquest, intrigue, poverty, oppression, division internally. And we're still facing with this deplorable problem. When you go into the scriptures, it talks about how we will be blind from who we are. Indeed, the most blind nation. How could we galvanize them? How could we campaign together to speak the truth about their condition and most importantly, to expose the injustice that has been done against them, against us. It has nothing to do with color. It has everything to do with nationalism, because essentially the modern concept of nation state, of nationalism, is a new thing that was created also as a part of European, Western European new way of thinking from the 1500 to 1700. But before then, nationalism was based on who are you? Where did you come from? Who's your father? It links back to gene, bloodline. And the interesting thing is that when you research these people, you find out they all come from the same gene. There was a time they were once a nation. The chosen people, the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, they had an agreement, a commandment to keep. They have a commandment to uphold, a commandment for rulership to uphold righteousness and teach the ways of righteousness to the world and bring the mysteries. They're disconnected from our heritage because we broke the commandment. Now we are facing this plight worldwide. And with that in mind, the question now is, what does Passover have to do with this? What does Passover have to do with the restoration? When you go into the scripture, you find out that, and when you research deep into the history of all these ancient people, from the Mayans to the Aztecas to the Incas, to the Igbos, the Benguelas, even all the way down to the people in Congo. When you study the history of the people in Angola, the Ghana, the Ashanti, when you study the history and go deep into the history of the indigenous people in Peru, the Taino Indians, what you find out that they both had something in common. What was that? Animal sacrifice. There was once a time that they all sacrificed. In fact, the North American Indians, when they made that migration from being carried off, the lost 10 tribes of Israel migrated from ancient Israel after being taken down by Assyrians. They were in Assyria for about 3 years and finally were released from the old world and this massive migration of people. Because now this is how did they get here? A massive migration of people from 721 BC into the new world started from there through Euphrates, through the narrow passages of the river. They came down, passing down the what you call the Eastern Africa, through island of Madagascar, by Indian Ocean, passing the southern tip of South Africa, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, and actually settling in the North, South, Central, and North America. So what does this mean? What you're going to find out, and history record this. We have books, ancient books that actually confirm this, as well as the Holy Scriptures. And what you find out that the first thing that they did when they actually came to the shores of South America, Brazil, if you will, was do a sacrifice. Because the scriptures told you that it was actually the Heavenly Father, on Eloah, the Hebrew powers, gods that actually sent them, allowed them to be the first people to inhabit the new world. And we found historical and archaeological documentation that actually shows you they were deep brown and dark-skinned black people with Negroid features that did animal sacrifice to the Most High. And guess what? For them to come back, animal sacrifice is not needed anymore. But what happened is that the Messiah, the anointed Savior, became a sacrifice for them to come back. So what needs to happen is that they need to know the implication of Passover to their present condition. They need to be taught what it means. They need to be taught what it means. That a system can be reversed. A system they can be restored back into their glorious, and that's what the basic concept of the gospel is all about. And the implication to the rest of the world. Because as we know, Apostle Paul mentioned that blindness happened to Israel until the fullness of Gentiles has been come in. And if the fall of them be the riches of the world, as we know, the massive, financial, economic explosion or industrial revolution happened on the blood of our people, of these people. Imagine what will happen when they come back. And that's the gospel when they says that through thy seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. We're summoning the whole world to speak the truth on this condition. We're summoning the Arabs to speak the truth on this condition. We're summoning the true Africans, the Egyptians and the Ethiopians, the Hausas, to speak the truth on this condition. We're summoning the Chinese. China has become a new exploiters of the same people, just like the Europeans have done in this new global system. We're summoning the Chinese, the Japanese, the Asians, the Iranians. We're summoning the Gentile nation. Yes, we're summoning the European powers, the Caucasian, to speak truth about this. And we're inviting everyone to the teaching on the Passover that is coming, 29th of this month, to mark the commemoration of the suffering, to remind them to the awakening, to understand our condition, what it means, and why it happened, and to understand the impact it will have to the world. We're looking at a world today where there's economic woes. We're looking at a world where there is poverty, unemployment, environmental degradation. We're looking at a world today where there's high level of crime, immorality, decadence, pollution, abortion, massive debt. And you know the government entities, the globalists that are controlling the earth, understand that they cannot solve it. Their economic principle, Keynesian economic principles, cannot solve it. Capitalism, in fact, is based on exploitation. And we're looking at a war that is coming to a screeching halt and total BAM, where everything will disintegrate. And the only solution boils down to those people. The only solution boils down to the poor of the earth, the chosen people, the Israelites. There's a calling for them to rise up and wake up. There's a calling for them to come back and understand that a Passover, a sacrifice has been done to them.
There are no reparations more valuable to us as a people than the restoration of our identity and our heritage. This can only be obtained if we return to the laws, statutes, and commandments set forth by the Holy Scripture, by the God of Israel. We are now biblically, according to the biblical calendar, we are approaching the Passover. This is a time for us to remember the first Exodus. Our deliverance was by the blood of the Lamb. And once again, we will be delivered by the blood of the Lamb.